The mahogany-paneled courtroom felt like a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings echoing with the whispered conversations of lawyers and the soft rustle of legal documents. I sat perfectly still in the back row, watching my parents at the plaintiff's table, their faces painted with the same smug confidence I'd seen my entire life. They had no idea I was there. They had no idea what was coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My mother, Patricia Blackwell, adjusted her designer blazer with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades performing respectability. Beside her, my father, Richard Blackwell, leaned back in his chair like a king surveying his domain. They were here to claim everything: my inheritance, my grandmother's estate, my entire financial future. In their minds, this was just another family dinner where they got to decide who deserved what. The bailiff's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. All rise, the Honorable Judge Martinez presiding. As everyone stood, I watched my parents' backs, their posture radiating the same arrogant certainty that had defined every interaction I'd ever had with them. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew what I was capable of. They were about to learn just how wrong they'd been their entire lives. But to understand how we got to this moment, how my own parents ended up trying to steal my inheritance while I sat in the shadows with evidence that would destroy them both, you have to understand that this courtroom confrontation was just the final chapter in a story that began 28 years ago in a nursery they never wanted me to leave. My name is Elena Rosewood, and for most of my life, I existed in the margins of my own family. Not because I was quiet or invisible, but because my parents, Richard and Patricia Blackwell, had crafted such a perfect narrative about who I was supposed to be that any evidence to the contrary simply didn't register in their carefully constructed reality. The Blackwell family lived in Riverside Heights, one of those suburban enclaves where success was measured in square footage and the shine of luxury cars in manicured driveways. Our house was a monument to my parents' social ambitions, all marble countertops and custom cabinetry, every room staged like a magazine spread. But if you looked closely, you'd notice something peculiar about the family photos that lined the hallways. There were plenty of pictures of my older brother Marcus at every stage of his development. Marcus at his high school graduation, Marcus at college, Marcus at his wedding, Marcus with his kids. And then there were the family portraits where I appeared as a kind of pleasant afterthought, always positioned slightly behind everyone else, my smile polite but somehow separate from the main event. This wasn't an accident. This was the visual representation of my role in the Blackwell family ecosystem. I was the supporting character in someone else's story, the responsible daughter who could be counted on to handle the tedious details while the real stars took center stage. The pattern established itself early. I remember being 12 years old, sitting at our massive dining room table, trying to tell my parents about making the honor roll at school. My mother barely looked up from her phone, where she was scrolling through photos of Marcus's latest college achievements. "That's nice, dear," she said, in that distracted tone that meant she wasn't really listening. "Marcus just got elected to student government. Isn't that wonderful?" My father, meanwhile, was already reaching for his wallet. "We should send him some extra spending money to celebrate," he announced, as if student government positions required financial rewards. The honor roll certificate I'd been so proud of suddenly felt like scrap paper in my hands. This became the rhythm of our household. Marcus's B- in economics was cause for celebration and a shopping trip. My straight A's were met with the kind of acknowledgement you'd give to someone who had successfully completed a mundane chore. When Marcus changed his major for the third time, it was evidence of his exploratory nature and his Renaissance soul. When I graduated summa cum laude from law school, the conversation at dinner somehow shifted to Marcus's promotion at his marketing firm within 5 minutes. But the most telling moment came during my law school graduation. I had worked myself to exhaustion for 3 years, maintaining a perfect GPA while working part-time to pay for expenses my parents deemed unnecessary. I had earned the highest honors in my class and was graduating as valedictorian. The ceremony was on a Saturday afternoon in May, and I had sent my parents the invitation months in advance. The morning of graduation, I called to confirm they were coming. My mother answered with that particular brand of exasperation she reserved for my inconvenient requests for attention. "Oh, Elena, I'm so sorry, but Marcus needs us to babysit the twins today. Sarah had to work unexpectedly, and you know how important her career is to their family's finances." The excuse was so perfectly crafted, so reasonably presented, that any objection would have seemed selfish. Marcus's wife's minimum wage retail job was apparently more important than their daughter's law school valedictorian speech. "We'll celebrate later," my mother promised, though we never did. I walked across that stage alone, my achievement witnessed by classmates and their families, but not by the people who were supposed to be proud of me. In the audience, I watched other graduates embrace their parents, saw mothers crying tears of joy, fathers beaming with pride. I felt like I was watching life through a window, observing something I would never quite be allowed to experience myself. That night, I got a text from my mother. "Congratulations on graduating, we're so proud," followed by 3 heart emojis, the kind of generic message you might send to a distant cousin. There was no mention of the honors, no acknowledgement of the years of sacrifice, no recognition that this was perhaps the most important academic achievement of my life. But Marcus got a surprise party when he got promoted to senior account coordinator. The financial dynamics of our family were perhaps even more telling than the emotional ones. My parents, both successful professionals with comfortable incomes, had very specific ideas about money and who deserved it. Marcus's college tuition was paid in full, with extra money for spring break trips and a new car when he turned 21. When I started law school, I was informed that education loans were character building and that I should be grateful for the opportunity to invest in myself. I remember sitting in the financial aid office, surrounded by forms and loan documents, calculating how much debt I would accumulate over the next 3 years. The numbers were staggering, but my parents were unmoved. "This will teach you the value of money," my father explained, as if financial struggle was a moral virtue rather than a practical hardship.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Meanwhile, Marcus received monthly allowances well into his 20s. When he wanted to buy his first house, my parents provided the down payment as a family investment. When his car broke down, they bought him a new one. When he and his wife wanted to take a vacation to Europe, it became a family gift for their wedding anniversary. I learned not to ask. I learned to handle my own emergencies, solve my own problems, pay my own bills. I became financially independent, not through choice, but through necessity. And somewhere along the way, this independence became another mark against me in my parents' ledger of family worth. My self-sufficiency wasn't seen as strength or competence. It was seen as evidence that I didn't need them, which somehow justified their decision to invest their emotional and financial resources elsewhere. The irony was that my independence made me more successful, not less. While Marcus relied on family money to solve every problem, I developed skills, built networks, and created value through my own efforts. By the time I was 25, I was earning more than both my parents combined. But in family conversations, my success was always downplayed or ignored entirely. I was making partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, handling complex corporate litigation, managing million-dollar cases. Marcus was still working in marketing, his career subsidized by regular family bailouts. But when relatives asked about their children's achievements, my parents would spend 20 minutes describing Marcus's latest project at work and mention me only as an afterthought. "Eleanor's doing well too," they'd say, as if my partnership at a major law firm was roughly equivalent to Marcus's participation in an office softball league. The pattern was so consistent, so deeply embedded in our family's operating system, that I began to wonder if I was imagining it. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe this was just how families worked, and I was expecting too much attention. Maybe the problem was me. This doubt was carefully cultivated by my mother, who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as maternal concern. Whenever I tried to express frustration about the family dynamics, she would respond with hurt confusion, as if I were attacking her for no reason. "I don't understand why you're so competitive with your brother," she would say, her voice trembling with wounded innocence. "We love you both equally. It's not a contest." But it was a contest, and the rules had been established long before I was old enough to understand them. Marcus was the heir apparent, the son who would carry on the family name and the family values. I was the insurance policy, the backup plan, the daughter who would handle the unglamorous responsibilities without expecting nothing in return. This became most apparent when my grandmother, Eleanor Blackwell, fell ill. Eleanor was my father's mother, a formidable woman who had built a successful real estate empire from nothing and had accumulated considerable wealth over her lifetime. She had always been fond of me, perhaps because she recognized something of her own independent spirit in my refusal to rely on family money. As Eleanor's health declined, it became clear that someone would need to handle her affairs, manage her properties, and make the difficult decisions about her care. Marcus, despite being the obvious choice in my parents' minds, was completely overwhelmed by the responsibility. He couldn't understand the financial documents, couldn't coordinate with doctors and lawyers, couldn't manage the complex web of properties and investments that comprised Eleanor's estate. So the responsibility fell to me. I spent months learning every detail of my grandmother's business, coordinating her medical care, managing her investments, and ensuring that her final years were comfortable and dignified. I did this while maintaining my own demanding legal practice, often working 16-hour days to balance both responsibilities. My parents saw this as natural and appropriate. It was what daughters did. It was what I was for. There was no acknowledgement of the sacrifice, no recognition of the complexity of the work, no appreciation for the time and expertise I was providing for free. It was simply expected, the way you might expect the sun to rise or the seasons to change. Eleanor, however, saw things differently. During one of our regular meetings to discuss her affairs, she looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that had intimidated business partners for decades. "You know, Eleanor, I've been watching this family for a long time," she said, her voice still strong despite her physical frailness. "I see how hard you work, and I see how little credit you get for it." I tried to deflect, to maintain the family fiction that everyone was treated equally, but Eleanor waved away my protests. "Don't insult my intelligence, dear. I've been managing people and money for 70 years. I know the difference between investment and exploitation." She paused, studying my face. "I want you to know that your efforts haven't gone unnoticed. When the time comes, you'll understand what I mean." At the time, I thought she was just being kind, offering the sort of vague reassurance that elderly relatives give to grandchildren who feel underappreciated. I had no idea she was telling me about decisions that would ultimately destroy my parents' carefully constructed world. Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in October. I was with her at the end, holding her hand in the hospice room, while my parents and Marcus were at Marcus's son's soccer game. Even in death, the priorities were clear. Family obligations were something Elena handled so that everyone else could attend to more important matters. The funeral was a grand affair, befitting someone of Eleanor's stature in the community. My parents orchestrated every detail, presenting themselves as the grieving son and daughter-in-law, accepting condolences and managing the social aspects of death with the same performative competence they brought to every public event. I sat in the front row, emotionally exhausted from months of caregiving and the immediate aftermath of loss, watching my parents accept sympathy for a burden they had never actually carried. Friends and business associates approached them with kind words about Eleanor's final years, praising them for their devotion and care. My parents nodded graciously, accepting credit for sacrifices they had never made. After the service, as people gathered at our house for the traditional post-funeral meal, I overheard my mother talking to Eleanor's longtime business partner. "It was so difficult," she was saying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Richard and I spent so much time managing her affairs, making sure she had everything she needed. It was a labor of love, but exhausting." The words hit me like a physical blow.
Not because they were cruel, but because they were so casually dishonest. My mother genuinely seemed to believe her own revisionist history, as if months of delegation and neglect had somehow transformed into personal sacrifice through the alchemy of grief. I excused myself from the gathering and went upstairs to my childhood bedroom, a space that had remained virtually unchanged since high school, like a museum exhibit of a person my parents had never really known. I sat on the narrow bed, surrounded by academic awards and honor society certificates that no one had ever bothered to frame, and tried to process the enormity of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't just about credit or recognition anymore. This was about truth itself, and my parents' remarkable ability to reshape reality to fit their preferred narrative. If they could convince themselves and others that they had been Eleanor's primary caregivers, what other stories had they edited to cast themselves as the heroes and me as the footnote? The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday. Eleanor's lawyer, James Morrison, had been handling her affairs for over 30 years and had worked closely with me during the final months of her life. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock in the morning at Morrison's downtown office, and attendance was limited to immediate family members. My parents arrived dressed like they were attending a board meeting, my father in his most expensive suit, my mother in an outfit that projected both grief and dignity in carefully calibrated proportions. Marcus wore the navy blazer he reserved for job interviews and court appearances, looking uncomfortable but trying to project the gravitas he assumed the occasion demanded. I chose simplicity, a black dress and minimal jewelry. I wasn't performing for anyone. I was there to hear Eleanor's final words and to honor the relationship we had built during her final years. Morrison's office was old-school elegance, all leather-bound books and brass fixtures, the kind of space where important family business had been conducted for generations. We sat around a polished conference table, the will in a sealed envelope at Morrison's right hand. He began with the standard legal preamble, the formal language that makes death feel like a business transaction. Then he started reading the specific bequests. Small gifts to longtime employees, donations to favorite charities, personal items distributed among friends. My parents nodded along, their faces showing appropriate solemnity, while their eyes calculated the diminishing value of the estate. Then Morrison reached the major bequests, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. My parents leaned forward slightly, their casual attention sharpening into focused interest. To my son, Richard Blackwell, I leave my gratitude for his support over the years, and my hope that he will find contentment in the life he has built. A pause. My father's face remained composed, but I could see the confusion beginning to form around his eyes. That was it? Gratitude and hope? To my daughter-in-law, Patricia Blackwell, I leave my appreciation for her role in our family, and my best wishes for her continued happiness. Another pause. My mother's smile was becoming increasingly forced, a mask that was beginning to crack at the edges. Morrison continued reading, and the bequests began to make my parents' position clear. Small monetary gifts to Marcus's children for their education. A modest sum to Marcus himself, enough to be meaningful but hardly life-changing. Polite, appropriate, but not the windfall they had been expecting. Then Morrison reached the final section, and his voice took on a slightly different tone, as if Eleanor herself were speaking from beyond the grave. To my granddaughter, Elena Rosewood Blackwell, who showed me such devoted care in my final years, and who has demonstrated the kind of character and competence that builds lasting legacies, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, to be managed as she sees fit. Elena has already proven herself capable of handling complex responsibility with wisdom and integrity. I trust her completely to honor the values that built this family's success. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on Morrison's wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the almost audible sound of my parents' world crashing down around them. My father was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled, but vibrating with barely contained fury. There must be some mistake. Eleanor would never. She couldn't have meant to exclude her own son from her primary inheritance. Morrison had clearly anticipated this reaction. Mrs. Blackwell was very clear about her intentions. She revised this will 6 months ago, and we discussed every provision in detail. She was of completely sound mind and very specific about her reasoning. My mother's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. Elena barely knew her grandmother. We were the ones taking care of Eleanor, managing her affairs, making sure she had everything she needed. This will is obviously the result of manipulation or coercion.
The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. In one sentence, my mother had dismissed months of my dedicated care and accused me of elderly abuse. The injustice was so breathtaking, so complete, that I almost admired its audacity. Morrison's response was crisp and professional. "Mrs. Blackwell, I worked with Eleanor for over 30 years. I can assure you that no one influenced her decisions inappropriately. In fact, she specifically asked me to document her reasoning for this distribution, anticipating that there might be questions." He opened another folder and began to read from Eleanor's own notes, written in her distinctive handwriting. "I have watched my family for many years, and I have seen how responsibility and sacrifice are distributed among my grandchildren. Elena has handled my affairs with competence and dedication, expecting nothing in return. She has shown me kindness and respect, not because she wanted something from me, but because she is a person of character. This inheritance is not a gift. It is recognition of value already demonstrated, and an investment in someone I trust to build something meaningful with what I have spent my lifetime creating." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on Morrison's wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the almost audible sound of my parents' world crashing down around them. My father was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled, but vibrating with barely contained fury. "There must be some mistake. Eleanor would never, she couldn't have meant to exclude her own son from her primary inheritance." Morrison had clearly anticipated this reaction. Mrs. Blackwell was very clear about her intentions. She revised this will 6 months ago, and we discussed every provision in detail. She was of completely sound mind and very specific about her reasoning. My mother's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. Elena barely knew her grandmother. We were the ones taking care of Eleanor, managing her affairs, making sure she had everything she needed. This will is obviously the result of manipulation or coercion." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. In one sentence, my mother had dismissed months of my dedicated care and accused me of elderly abuse. The injustice was so breathtaking, so complete, that I almost admired its audacity. Morrison's response was crisp and professional. "Mrs. Blackwell, I worked with Eleanor for over 30 years. I can assure you that no one influenced her decisions inappropriately. In fact, she specifically asked me to document her reasoning for this distribution, anticipating that there might be questions." He opened another folder and began to read from Eleanor's own notes, written in her distinctive handwriting. "I have watched my family for many years, and I have seen how responsibility and sacrifice are distributed among my grandchildren. Elena has handled my affairs with competence and dedication, expecting nothing in return. She has shown me kindness and respect, not because she wanted something from me, but because she is a person of character. This inheritance is not a gift. It is recognition of value already demonstrated, and an investment in someone I trust to build something meaningful with what I have spent my lifetime creating."
The words were devastating in their quiet accuracy. Eleanor had seen everything. She had understood the family dynamics that my parents thought were invisible. She had witnessed their neglect and my dedication, and she had made her judgment accordingly. My father tried a different approach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he wanted to convince someone he was being rational rather than desperate. Even if Eleanor felt this way, surely she would want the estate to remain in the family name. Elena is married. The Blackwell properties and businesses should stay with the Blackwell. This was news to me, since I had been single for the past 2 years and had never mentioned marriage to anyone in the family. But my father was grasping at straws, inventing obstacles that didn't exist. Morrison consulted his notes again. Mrs. Blackwell anticipated this concern as well. Elena is legally a Blackwell regardless of her marital status, and the will includes provisions for maintaining the family business names and legacy properties. Mrs. Blackwell was very thorough in addressing potential objections. My mother tried one final strategy, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she wanted to make other people feel guilty for her problems. "I just can't believe Eleanor would do something so divisive to her own family. This is going to tear us apart." The irony was staggering.
For decades, my parents had treated me as a peripheral figure in my own family, excluding me from celebrations, dismissing my achievements, and exploiting my sense of duty. Now, when their neglect had finally caught up with them, they were concerned about family unity. I spoke for the first time since entering Morrison's office, my voice steady and calm. The estate will be managed according to Eleanor's wishes and in the best interests of the family legacy she built. I intend to honor her memory and her values. My words were diplomatic and appropriate, but my parents heard them as a declaration of war. In their minds, I had somehow orchestrated this outcome, manipulated a dying woman, and stolen what rightfully belonged to them. The meeting ended with cold formalities and barely contained hostility. Morrison provided copies of the will and explained the legal processes that would need to be completed. My parents left the office in tight-lipped fury, their faces masks of outraged dignity. I stayed behind to discuss practical matters with Morrison, and when we were alone, he offered an observation that would prove prophetic. "Elena, I want you to prepare yourself for what's coming next. Your parents are not going to accept this quietly. In my experience, when people feel entitled to money they don't receive, they often convince themselves that the will was invalid or that some form of manipulation took place. You may find yourself dealing with legal challenges." His warning proved accurate sooner than either of us expected. The first shot was fired 3 days later, when I received a certified letter from Hartwell and Associates, a law firm my parents had hired to challenge Eleanor's will. The language was formal and threatening, accusing me of undue influence, manipulation of a vulnerable elderly person, and fraud in the execution of testamentary documents. The letter demanded that I agree to mediation to reach a fair distribution of Eleanor's estate, with the clear implication that refusal would result in a full legal challenge. The proposed fair distribution involved giving me a small cash bequest while transferring all properties and business interests to my father as Eleanor's rightful heir. I read the letter twice, marveling at the audacity. My parents were essentially arguing that I had provided such good care to Eleanor that it constituted manipulation, and that their neglect of her was evidence of their moral superiority. They were claiming that their absence during her final months proved they hadn't been trying to influence her decisions, while my presence proved that I had. The logic was so twisted that it was almost artistic in its dishonesty. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, Sarah Chen, a colleague from the firm who specialized in estate litigation. Her response was swift and pointed. "Elena, this is exactly the kind of case I love to defend. Your parents' attorneys are essentially arguing that competent care equals manipulation, while neglect equals integrity. It's not going to hold up in court, but it's going to be expensive and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Are you prepared for that?" I was more than prepared. I was ready. Because what my parents didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Eleanor and I had anticipated this exact scenario. During our final months together, as Eleanor's health declined and her awareness of family dynamics sharpened, she had made sure to document everything. Every conversation with my parents about her care had been recorded. Every excuse they made for missing appointments, every responsibility they delegated to me, every instance of their absence during crucial moments had been carefully noted and preserved. Eleanor had been building a case against their challenge before they even knew there would be one to make. More importantly, Eleanor had insisted on regular psychological evaluations during the final year of her life, specifically to establish her mental competency and to document that her decisions were being made freely and without coercion. She had worked with Morrison to create a paper trail that would be virtually impossible to challenge successfully. "They're going to claim I manipulated a vulnerable old woman," I told Sarah during our strategy meeting. "What they don't realize is that the vulnerable old woman was smarter than all of them combined." Sarah smiled, the kind of expression lawyers get when they realize they're holding all the good cards. "Elena, I've seen a lot of estate challenges over the years. Most of them succeed because families don't prepare for them. But your grandmother was clearly several steps ahead of everyone else. This is going to be fun." The formal legal challenge was filed 6 weeks later. The complaint was a masterpiece of creative legal fiction, painting me as a manipulative schemer who had isolated Eleanor from her loving family in order to fraudulently obtain her inheritance. It described my parents as devoted caregivers who had been cruelly excluded from their rightful inheritance through my machinations. Reading the document was like encountering an alternate history of the previous year, one where my parents' neglect had been transformed into noble restraint, and my dedicated care had become evidence of criminal intent. It was so completely divorced from reality that I almost admired the imagination required to construct it. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, Sarah Chen, a colleague from the firm who specialized in estate litigation. Her response was swift and pointed. "Elena, this is exactly the kind of case I love to defend. Your parents' attorneys are essentially arguing that competent care equals manipulation, while neglect equals integrity. It's not going to hold up in court, but it's going to be expensive and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Are you prepared for that?" I was more than prepared. I was ready. Because what my parents didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Eleanor and I had anticipated this exact scenario. During our final months together, as Eleanor's health declined and her awareness of family dynamics sharpened, she had made sure to document everything. Every conversation with my parents about her care had been recorded. Every excuse they made for missing appointments, every responsibility they delegated to me, every instance of their absence during crucial moments had been carefully noted and preserved. Eleanor had been building a case against their challenge before they even knew there would be one to make. More importantly, Eleanor had insisted on regular psychological evaluations during the final year of her life, specifically to establish her mental competency and to document that her decisions were being made freely and without coercion. She had worked with Morrison to create a paper trail that would be virtually impossible to challenge successfully. "They're going to claim I manipulated a vulnerable old woman," I told Sarah during our strategy meeting. "What they don't realize is that the vulnerable old woman was smarter than all of them combined." Sarah smiled, the kind of expression lawyers get when they realize they're holding all the good cards. "Elena, I've seen a lot of estate challenges over the years. Most of them succeed because families don't prepare for them. But your grandmother was clearly several steps ahead of everyone else. This is going to be fun." The formal legal challenge was filed 6 weeks later. The complaint was a masterpiece of creative legal fiction, painting me as a manipulative schemer who had isolated Eleanor from her loving family in order to fraudulently obtain her inheritance. It described my parents as devoted caregivers who had been cruelly excluded from their rightful inheritance through my machinations. Reading the document was like encountering an alternate history of the previous year, one where my parents' neglect had been transformed into noble restraint, and my dedicated care had become evidence of criminal intent. It was so completely divorced from reality that I almost admired the imagination required to construct it.
The case was assigned to Judge Maria Martinez, a veteran of estate litigation with a reputation for cutting through family drama to focus on legal facts. The initial hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February, and my parents approached it with the confidence of people who had never doubted their own version of events. They arrived at the courthouse dressed like they were attending a charity gala, projecting the kind of wounded dignity that suggested they were victims of a terrible injustice. Marcus was with them, serving as both moral support and additional evidence of the family they claimed I had betrayed. I arrived alone, carrying a single briefcase that contained everything I needed to destroy their case. The courtroom was smaller than the one where I would later sit watching them try to steal my inheritance, but it had the same feeling of impending judgment. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a silver-haired man who specialized in the kind of emotional manipulation that sometimes worked with juries but rarely impressed judges. Their opening statement was a performance piece, full of dramatic pauses and wounded indignation. Their attorney painted a picture of loving parents who had been excluded from their mother's final months by a manipulative daughter who had isolated Eleanor in order to control her decisions. "Your Honor, this is a classic case of elder abuse disguised as caring devotion. The defendant systematically excluded her own parents from Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell's life, controlling her access to information and manipulating her emotions in order to fraudulently obtain an inheritance that rightfully belongs to her son." It was masterfully done, hitting all the emotional notes that might resonate with someone who didn't know the actual facts.
My parents nodded along, their faces showing the kind of pained resignation that suggested they were reluctantly seeking justice for a beloved family member. Then it was Sarah's turn, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes family devotion versus family exploitation. They claim to have been excluded from Mrs. Blackwell's care, but the evidence will show that they systematically delegated every aspect of that care to the defendant while maintaining their social and financial interests in the estate. She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. Mrs. Blackwell, anticipating exactly this type of challenge, spent considerable time documenting her decisions and her reasoning. She also ensured that her mental competency was regularly evaluated and certified. What we have here is not a case of manipulation, but a case of an intelligent woman making informed decisions about people she had observed for decades. Sarah began presenting evidence, and I watched my parents' confident expressions slowly dissolve into horror. First came the recordings. Eleanor had secretly recorded several conversations with my parents during her final year, including one particularly damning exchange where my father had explicitly stated that managing Eleanor's care was Elena's job because she was single and had more time for that kind of thing. The recordings were devastating because they captured my parents in their own words, casually discussing how to minimize their own responsibilities while maximizing their inheritance expectations. Their neglect wasn't accidental or born of grief, it was strategic and deliberate. Next came the medical records and psychological evaluations. Eleanor had insisted on monthly mental competency assessments during the final year of her life, specifically to prevent the kind of challenge my parents were now making. The evaluation showed a woman who was not only mentally sharp, but increasingly aware of family dynamics and determined to make decisions based on demonstrated rather than assumed loyalty. Finally, Sarah presented Eleanor's personal journals, written in her own hand and authenticated by handwriting experts. The entries painted a detailed picture of a woman who had spent months carefully observing her family and making judgments based on behavior rather than rhetoric. One entry, written just 2 months before Eleanor's death, was particularly devastating. Richard called today to ask about changing my investment strategy. He has never shown interest in my business affairs before, but now he wants to help me make decisions. Meanwhile, Elena spent 4 hours yesterday organizing my medical appointments and never mentioned money once. The difference in motivation is becoming increasingly clear. Another entry, written shortly before Eleanor revised her will, was even more damning. Patricia called to complain that Elena is becoming too controlling about my care. She wants to know why Elena is making decisions about my doctors and my treatments. The irony is breathtaking. They object to Elena taking responsibility for things they refuse to handle themselves. They want the authority without the work, and they want the inheritance without the sacrifice. As Sarah read these entries aloud, I could see my parents shrinking into their chairs. The woman they had dismissed as a convenient source of inheritance money had been watching them with the sharp eyes of someone who had built a business empire from nothing. She had seen through their performance and documented their true character with ruthless precision. The final blow came when Sarah presented documentation of all the times my parents had been asked to help with Eleanor's care and had declined. Medical appointments they had missed, financial meetings they had skipped, emergency situations where they had been unavailable. Every instance of neglect had been carefully recorded, creating an undeniable pattern of abandonment. My parents' attorney tried to recover, arguing that physical absence didn't necessarily indicate emotional distance, but Judge Martinez had clearly heard enough. Counselor, the evidence presented here suggests that your clients delegated all practical aspects of Mrs. Blackwell's care to the defendant while maintaining their expectation of inheritance. The deceased appears to have been remarkably thorough in documenting both her mental capacity and her reasoning for the distribution of her estate. I see no evidence of undue influence. The judge's words were like a death sentence for my parents' case, but their attorney made one final desperate attempt. Your Honor, even if the defendant provided physical care, the emotional manipulation involved in excluding loving parents from their mother's final months represents a form of elder abuse that should invalidate any benefits gained through such manipulation. Judge Martinez's response was swift and final. Counselor, providing competent care to an elderly family member while other family members choose not to participate is not manipulation. It is responsibility. Mrs. Blackwell's will stands as written. The case was over. My parents had lost not just their legal challenge, but any remaining pretense that their version of family history was based in reality. The court records would forever document their neglect and my dedication, creating a permanent record of the family dynamics they had spent years trying to conceal. As we left the courthouse, my parents refused to make eye contact with me. Their faces were masks of humiliated rage, the expressions of people who had been publicly exposed as frauds. They had expected to waltz into court and claim their rightful inheritance through sheer force of entitlement. Instead, they had been systematically destroyed by evidence of their own neglect and their mother's superior intelligence. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Because what I learned over the following months, as I began to examine Eleanor's estate in detail, was that my parents' neglect and manipulation hadn't been limited to emotional abuse.
They had been systematically stealing from Eleanor for years, siphoning money from her accounts and using her credit to cover their own expenses. Eleanor's careful record-keeping had documented this financial abuse as well, and she had left me not just her estate, but a comprehensive case for criminal charges against the people who had been robbing her while I was providing her care. The inheritance they had tried to steal legally was about to become evidence in a criminal case that would send them both to prison. But that revelation, and the moment when I walked into a courtroom and handed Judge Martinez the document that made police storm out to arrest my own parents, is a story for the next part, because the real reckoning was just beginning. The victory in court should have brought me closure, but instead it opened a door to a much darker truth that had been hiding beneath the surface of my family's dysfunction. As I began the process of managing Eleanor's estate, what started as routine administrative work quickly revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Eleanor's financial records were meticulous, organized with the precision of someone who had built and maintained wealth for over 50 years. Every transaction was documented, every investment tracked, every expense categorized. It was the kind of system that most people would find overwhelming, but as a corporate litigation attorney, I found it remarkably easy to navigate. What I found in those records changed everything. The first irregularity appeared in Eleanor's checking account statements from 3 years earlier. Small withdrawals at first, amounts that could easily be explained as routine expenses or cash gifts. $50 here, $100 there, the kind of modest sums that might go unnoticed by someone who wasn't looking carefully. But I was looking carefully, and the pattern became obvious once you knew what to search for. The withdrawals always happened on specific days of the month, always in round numbers, and always corresponded to dates when my parents had visited Eleanor or called her about financial matters. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with Eleanor's appointment calendar, another meticulously maintained record that tracked every visitor, every phone call, every social interaction. The correlation was undeniable. Every suspicious withdrawal coincided with contact from my parents. As I dug deeper into the financial history, the scope of the theft became staggering. What had started as small, seemingly innocent amounts had grown into systematic looting that spanned nearly 4 years. The pattern showed a careful escalation, as if my parents had been testing Eleanor's awareness and gradually increasing their theft as they realized she either hadn't noticed or wasn't going to confront them. The methods were sophisticated and clearly calculated to avoid detection. They had convinced Eleanor to add them as authorized users on several of her credit cards, ostensibly to help with emergency purchases or to handle expenses when she was unable to do so herself. Instead, they had used those cards for personal purchases, vacation expenses, home improvements, and luxury items that had nothing to do with Eleanor's care or needs. The credit card statements told a story of breathtaking greed and deception. Charges at high-end restaurants on dates when Eleanor was in the hospital and couldn't possibly have been dining out. Hotel expenses for weekend getaways that my parents had taken while claiming to be too busy to visit Eleanor. Thousands of dollars in home improvement charges for work done on my parents' house, not Eleanor's. One particularly damning series of transactions showed charges at an exclusive jewelry store totaling over $15,000,
made during the week Eleanor was having her gallbladder surgery. While I was at the hospital managing her care and recovery, my parents were across town using her credit cards to buy jewelry for my mother's birthday. But the credit card fraud was just the beginning. The deeper I dug into Eleanor's financial records, the more elaborate the theft became. My parents had convinced Eleanor to sign documents that they claimed were for tax purposes or estate planning, but which actually transferred small portions of her investment accounts into accounts they controlled. They had set up a systematic scheme where they would present Eleanor with official-looking documents during family visits, usually when she was tired or distracted, and ask her to sign them as routine paperwork. Eleanor, trusting her son and daughter-in-law, had signed whatever they put in front of her, not realizing that she was gradually transferring portions of her wealth to accounts that my parents could access freely. The sophistication of the scheme was remarkable. They had created shell companies and investment accounts that appeared legitimate on the surface, but were actually vehicles for transferring Eleanor's money to their own use. They had forged her signature on documents, backdated transactions to avoid suspicion, and created false paperwork to justify transfers that were nothing more than theft. The total amount stolen over the 4-year period was over $200,000, money that Eleanor had earned through decades of careful investment and business management, systematically siphoned away by the people she trusted most. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the theft was how they had used my own presence in Eleanor's life to facilitate their crimes. Every time I took over more responsibility for Eleanor's care, my parents gained more unsupervised access to her financial affairs. They had deliberately encouraged my involvement in her day-to-day care because it gave them cover to handle the financial aspects of her life without scrutiny. While I was driving Eleanor to medical appointments and managing her medications, my parents were forging her signature on investment documents. While I was researching treatment options and coordinating with specialists, they were transferring money from her accounts to their own. While I was providing emotional support and companionship, they were literally robbing her blind. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My dedication to Eleanor's care hadn't just been unappreciated by my parents. It had been exploited as part of their criminal enterprise. They had used my sense of responsibility as a weapon against both Eleanor and me, manipulating our family dynamics to create opportunities for theft. I spent 3 weeks documenting every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every illegitimate transfer. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. My parents hadn't just neglected Eleanor emotionally, they had systematically robbed her while she was dying. The legal implications were staggering. What I had discovered wasn't just civil fraud that could be resolved through lawsuits and financial settlements. This was criminal elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery and theft on a massive scale. These were felony charges that carried significant prison sentences. I sat in my office late one night, surrounded by boxes of financial documents and evidence, and tried to process the magnitude of what I had uncovered. My parents weren't just selfish and neglectful, they were criminals. They had spent years systematically stealing from a dying woman while manipulating their own daughter to provide cover for their crimes. The emotional impact was almost overwhelming. I had grown up believing that my parents were simply self-absorbed and favoritistic. I had accepted their treatment of me as an unfortunate family dynamic, painful but not criminal. Now I realized that their behavior toward me hadn't been separate from their criminal activity. It had been part of it. Every time they had dismissed my achievements, every instance where they had treated me as an unpaid servant, every moment when they had made me feel invisible or unworthy had been calculated to maintain a family structure that facilitated their theft. They needed me to be dependent on their approval so that I would continue providing care without asking questions. They needed me to feel grateful for any attention so that I wouldn't examine their financial activities too closely.
My entire childhood and young adulthood had been shaped by their need to maintain the perfect cover for elder abuse. But as the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by something colder and more focused. I was no longer just Eleanor's granddaughter seeking to honor her wishes. I was a trained attorney with expertise in complex financial crimes, and I had just discovered evidence of systematic criminal activity that demanded justice. I called Sarah Chen the next morning and asked her to meet me at my office. When she arrived, I had organized the evidence into clear, chronological presentations that told the story of my parents' theft in overwhelming detail. "Sarah, I need to show you something that changes everything about this case," I began, and spent the next 2 hours walking her through every aspect of the financial fraud I had discovered. Sarah's expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the evidence. As a civil attorney, she dealt with financial disputes regularly, but the scope and sophistication of my parents' theft clearly shocked her. "Elena, this is way beyond civil litigation," she said finally. "What you've uncovered here represents serious criminal activity. We're talking about multiple felony charges, potentially decades in prison. You need to contact the district attorney's office immediately." But I had already thought through the implications, and I had a different plan. "Sarah, I want to handle this through the proper channels, but I want to do it strategically. My parents think they've gotten away with this. They believe that winning their civil case would have covered up their criminal activity, and losing it just means they don't get the inheritance they wanted. They have no idea that I've discovered their real crimes." I outlined my strategy. Rather than immediately contacting law enforcement, I wanted to give my parents an opportunity to confess and make restitution, not because I felt sympathy for them, but because I wanted to see how far their deception would go when confronted with undeniable evidence of their crimes. "I want to arrange a family meeting," I explained. "I want to present them with the evidence of their theft and give them a chance to explain themselves. If they confess and agree to full restitution, we can discuss handling this through civil channels. If they continue to lie and deny their crimes, then we turn everything over to the district attorney." Sarah looked skeptical. "Elena, that's giving them a chance to destroy evidence, flee the jurisdiction, or create additional legal problems. Criminal elder abuse isn't something you negotiate about in family meetings." But I had made my decision. I need to know who they really are. I need to see if they're capable of honesty when confronted with proof of their crimes, or if they'll continue lying even when the evidence is undeniable. I need to understand the full extent of their deception before I decide how to proceed. Sarah agreed to help structure the meeting in a way that would protect the legal integrity of the evidence while giving my parents the opportunity I wanted to provide. We scheduled the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at Morrison's law office, a neutral location where conversations could be recorded legally and where the presence of attorneys would reinforce the seriousness of the situation. I called my parents and asked them to meet me to discuss some irregularities in Eleanor's financial records that needed to be addressed before the estate could be finalized. I kept the language vague but official sounding, giving them no indication of what I had actually discovered. My father's response was immediately suspicious. "What kind of irregularities? The court already ruled that Eleanor's will was valid. There shouldn't be any problems with finalizing the estate." "There are some financial transactions that don't seem to match Eleanor's usual patterns," I said carefully. "The estate attorney wants to review them with the family before proceeding. It's probably nothing, but we need to document everything properly for tax purposes." There was a long pause before my father responded. "Fine, but this better not be another attempt to drag out the estate settlement. We've all been through enough." The tone of his voice told me everything I needed to know. He was worried, but he was also trying to project authority and irritation to mask his concern. If the financial irregularities were innocent, his reaction would have been curiosity or mild annoyance. The defensive anger suggested he knew exactly what I had found. My mother was even more revealing when I called her separately. "Elena, what exactly are you accusing us of? We've never taken anything from Eleanor that wasn't properly documented and approved. If there are problems with the financial records, maybe you should be looking at your own handling of her affairs." The immediate deflection and counter-accusation confirmed my suspicions. An innocent person would have asked what kind of problems I had found and offered to help resolve them. Only someone with knowledge of wrongdoing would immediately assume they were being accused of something and try to shift blame to someone else. The days leading up to the meeting were surreal. I went about my normal routine, handling client cases and managing estate business, while knowing that I was about to confront my parents with evidence that they were criminals.
I felt like I was living in two different worlds simultaneously: the ordinary world of daily responsibilities and the hidden world of family secrets that was about to explode into the open. I also used those days to prepare additional evidence and to consult with prosecutors about the proper procedures for handling what I had discovered. The district attorney's office assigned Detective Maria Santos to review the financial evidence and advise me on the legal implications of confronting my parents before filing formal charges. Detective Santos was a veteran investigator who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. She reviewed my evidence with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had seen every form of family financial manipulation imaginable. Miss Blackwell, what you've documented here is one of the most comprehensive cases of elder financial abuse I've seen in 20 years of investigating these crimes, she told me during our meeting. The sophistication of the scheme, the amount of money involved, and the systematic nature of the theft make this a high-priority case for prosecution. She was also supportive of my decision to confront my parents before filing charges, but with important caveats. Family confrontations can be valuable for getting confessions and understanding the full scope of criminal activity, but they can also give criminals opportunities to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We need to structure this meeting carefully to protect both the legal case and your personal safety.
The safety concern hadn't occurred to me, but Detective Santos explained that financial criminals often became violent when confronted with evidence of their crimes, especially when the confrontation came from family members they had been manipulating for years. Your parents have built their entire adult relationship with you around the assumption that they could control your perceptions and reactions, she explained. When that control is threatened by undeniable evidence of their crimes, they may react unpredictably. We want someone present who can ensure your safety and serve as an independent witness to whatever happens. We arranged for Detective Santos to be present at the meeting, introduced as a consultant helping with the estate's financial review. Her presence would provide security and ensure that any confessions or admissions would be properly witnessed and documented. The Saturday of the meeting arrived gray and cold, with the kind of winter weather that seemed appropriate for family reckonings. I arrived at Morrison's office early to review the evidence presentation one final time and to prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. Morrison had arranged his conference room to facilitate the kind of serious discussion we were about to have. The financial documents were organized in clear presentations, with copies prepared for my parents and their attorney if they chose to bring legal representation. The room's recording equipment was tested and ready, and Detective Santos had positioned herself where she could observe everyone without being conspicuous. My parents arrived precisely on time, dressed in their usual performance of respectability, but with an underlying tension that was immediately apparent. My father's jaw was set in the stubborn expression he wore when he expected to be challenged. My mother's smile was strained and artificial, the social mask she used when she was nervous but trying to maintain appearances. Marcus was with them, playing his familiar role as moral support and family witness. He looked uncomfortable, as if he suspected this meeting might involve unpleasant revelations but wasn't sure what to expect. "Elena," my father began before anyone had even sat down, "I want to make it clear that we're here as a courtesy to you and out of respect for Eleanor's memory, but we're not going to tolerate any more attempts to question Eleanor's estate or our family's handling of her affairs." The preemptive defensiveness was exactly what I had expected. He was trying to control the narrative before he even knew what evidence I had discovered. "Thank you all for coming," I replied calmly. "I've asked you here because I've discovered some financial irregularities in Eleanor's records that need to be addressed before the estate can be properly closed. I want to give you an opportunity to review the evidence and provide explanations before I take any further action." I gestured to the organized presentations on the conference table. These documents show a pattern of unusual financial activity over the past 4 years. I'd like to walk through them with you systematically so you can help me understand what happened. My mother leaned forward, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she felt unfairly accused. "Elena, I hope you're not suggesting that we did anything improper with Eleanor's finances. We always acted with her full knowledge and consent." "Let's look at the evidence together," I replied, "and you can explain each transaction as we review it."
I began with the credit card statements, laying out the chronological pattern of charges that had nothing to do with Eleanor's care or needs. The jewelry purchases, the restaurant expenses, the vacation charges, the home improvement costs. Each document told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. My parents' reactions were fascinating to observe. My father maintained an expression of irritated confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I was questioning routine expenses. My mother's face showed flashes of genuine panic, quickly covered by wounded indignation. These charges were all approved by Eleanor, my father said firmly. She wanted us to use her cards for family expenses. She considered it part of her contribution to family unity. So Eleanor approved $15,000 in jewelry purchases while she was in the hospital having surgery? I asked, pointing to the specific dates and charges. She had asked Patricia to pick out something nice for her birthday, my father replied without missing a beat. Eleanor wanted to make sure Patricia felt appreciated for all the care she was providing. The lie was so smooth and confident that I almost admired its audacity. He was creating an entirely fictional narrative to explain away obvious theft, and he was doing it with the kind of conviction that suggested he might actually believe his own story. My mother nodded along supportively. Eleanor was always very generous about family expenses. She understood that caring for her required sacrifices from all of us, and she wanted to make sure those sacrifices were recognized. I moved to the next category of evidence, the forged investment documents and unauthorized account transfers. These were much harder to explain away with stories about Eleanor's generosity, since they involved documents with her signature that she could never have understood or approved. As I laid out the evidence of systematic account manipulation, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. My parents could no longer maintain their facades of confused innocence. The evidence was too detailed, too comprehensive, and too obviously criminal to be dismissed with simple explanations. My father's strategy shifted to aggressive offense. Elena, what you're describing is a fantasy based on your misunderstanding of Eleanor's business practices. She often asked us to help her with investment decisions and account management. Everything we did was with her full knowledge and at her specific request. Including forging her signature on documents she never saw? I asked, pointing to signature analysis that showed clear evidence of forgery on multiple investment transfers. We never forged anything, my mother said, her voice rising with indignation. Eleanor's signature varied depending on her health and energy levels. Just because her handwriting looked different doesn't mean anything was forged. It was another smooth lie, delivered with conviction, but completely contradicted by the expert analysis I had commissioned. They were continuing to lie even when confronted with scientific evidence of their crimes. I presented the final category of evidence, Eleanor's own documentation of their theft. Her personal notes recording suspicious conversations, her concerns about unauthorized charges, her growing awareness that money was disappearing from her accounts. One note in particular was devastating. Written just 3 months before Eleanor's death, it described a conversation where my father had pressured her to sign investment documents she didn't understand, promising that they were routine paperwork while actually transferring significant funds to accounts he controlled. She was getting paranoid in her final months, my mother said dismissively. Elderly people often become suspicious and confused about financial matters. Eleanor was starting to imagine problems that didn't exist.
The casual cruelty of the statement took my breath away. She was describing a woman who had been sharp and competent until her final weeks, dismissing Eleanor's accurate concerns about theft as evidence of mental decline. Detective Santos chose that moment to introduce herself and her role in the investigation. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell, I'm Detective Santos with the Financial Crimes Unit. I've been reviewing the evidence Miss Blackwell has presented, and I need to inform you that what we're discussing here constitutes potential criminal elder abuse. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All pretense of family discussion disappeared, replaced by the stark reality of criminal investigation. My parents' faces went white as they realized this wasn't just a family dispute about estate management. Are we being accused of a crime? My father asked, his voice carefully controlled. You're being given an opportunity to explain financial irregularities that appear to constitute systematic theft from a vulnerable elderly person, Detective Santos replied. How you choose to respond will determine how this investigation proceeds.
My mother began to cry, not the genuine tears of someone experiencing grief or regret, but the calculated tears of someone trying to manipulate a difficult situation. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. We loved Eleanor and would never have hurt her. Elena is trying to destroy our family because she's angry about the inheritance. It was a masterful performance, hitting every emotional note that might generate sympathy from people who didn't know the actual facts. But Detective Santos and I were not moved by theatrical displays of wounded innocence. My father tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and suggesting that any problems could be resolved privately. Even if there were some irregularities in Eleanor's financial management, surely this is something that should be handled within the family. Eleanor has her inheritance, we have our reputations to consider. Can't we work something out that doesn't involve criminal accusations? The offer was essentially a confession disguised as a negotiation. He was acknowledging that irregularities had occurred while trying to minimize their significance and avoid legal consequences. I had heard everything I needed to hear. My parents were continuing to lie, continuing to manipulate, and continuing to treat serious crimes as minor family disagreements that could be resolved through private negotiation. They showed no genuine remorse, no real understanding of the harm they had caused, and no willingness to take responsibility for their actions. Detective Santos, I said formally, I would like to proceed with filing criminal charges based on the evidence we've discussed. The transformation in my parents' demeanor was instantaneous. The masks of wounded dignity fell away, replaced by expressions of genuine terror and rage. They finally understood that this wasn't a family meeting they could manipulate or control. This was the beginning of a criminal case that could destroy their lives. My father's voice turned vicious. "You vindictive little bitch. You're going to destroy your own family because you can't stand that Eleanor chose to share her wealth with people who actually cared about her." My mother's tears stopped as if they had been turned off with a switch. "This is what we get for treating you like family instead of the ungrateful stranger you've always been. Eleanor would be ashamed of what you're doing to us." The sudden shift to open hostility was revealing. When manipulation failed, their true feelings about me emerged with startling clarity. I wasn't their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was an obstacle to their desires, and when that obstacle became insurmountable, their hatred became explicit. Marcus, who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "Elena, is this really necessary? Can't we handle this without involving the police? They're our parents." His plea came from genuine confusion and family loyalty, but it also showed how completely he had been insulated from the reality of our parents' criminal behavior. He still saw this as a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. "Marcus, they stole over $200,000 from a dying woman while manipulating me to provide cover for their theft," I replied. "This isn't a family disagreement. It's systematic elder abuse that requires criminal prosecution." Detective Santos ended the meeting by informing my parents that they were subjects of a criminal investigation and advising them to contact attorneys immediately. The financial evidence would be presented to the district attorney's office for formal charges, and they could expect to be contacted by investigators within the next few days. As my parents left Morrison's office, their faces were masks of fury and terror. They had arrived expecting to manage another family crisis through manipulation and performance. They were leaving as criminal suspects facing potential prison sentences. But what they didn't realize was that the evidence I had presented was only part of what I had discovered. The meeting had been a test of their character, and they had failed it completely. Their continued lies and attempts at manipulation had convinced me that they deserved no mercy and no consideration for family relationship. The real reckoning was just beginning, and they had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Over the following week, I worked with Detective Santos and the district attorney's office to prepare formal criminal charges. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutors were eager to pursue a case that represented such clear-cut elder abuse. But as we prepared the legal case, I continued investigating Eleanor's financial records, and I discovered something that changed everything once again. Hidden in Eleanor's business files was evidence of additional criminal activity that was far more serious than simple theft. My parents hadn't just been stealing Eleanor's money, they had been using her identity and her business relationships to commit financial fraud on a much larger scale. They had been forging her signature on business contracts, using her credit to secure loans they had no intention to repaying, and manipulating her business partnerships to divert money to their own accounts. The scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering.
They had turned Eleanor's final years into a systematic looting operation that extended far beyond simple family theft. They had committed crimes that carried potential sentences of decades in prison, and I had documentation of all of it. The meeting in Morrison's conference room had been just the beginning. The real confrontation was going to happen in a courtroom where my parents would discover that their criminal activities had been even more comprehensively documented than they could possibly imagine. They thought they were facing charges for stealing from a family member. They were actually facing charges for operating a sophisticated financial fraud enterprise that had targeted a vulnerable elderly woman and her business associates. The evidence I was about to present to the court would not just send them to prison, it would destroy every aspect of the life they had built on the foundation of lies, manipulation, and theft. And unlike our family meetings, this confrontation would happen in public, with consequences they could never manipulate, minimize, or escape. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning in March, and my parents were arrested at their home before dawn. I wasn't there to witness it, but Detective Santos called me afterward to describe how it had unfolded. They had answered the door expecting perhaps a neighbor or a delivery, only to find themselves face to face with a team of investigators armed with arrest warrants and search warrants for their property. My father had tried to maintain his usual air of indignant authority even as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "This is outrageous," he had declared to anyone within earshot. "We're being persecuted by our own daughter because of a family inheritance dispute." Even facing criminal charges, he was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to cast himself as the victim of my vindictiveness, rather than as a criminal who had been caught. My mother had collapsed into hysterics, sobbing about family betrayal and asking how her own daughter could destroy her parents' lives over money. The performance was designed to generate sympathy from neighbors and investigators, but the officers had seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize manipulation when they encountered it. Marcus called me within hours of their arrest, his voice shaking with confusion and anger. "Elena, what have you done? Mom and Dad are in jail. There are police cars in their driveway and reporters asking questions. This has gone way too far." I could hear the genuine distress in his voice, and for a moment I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. Marcus had been so thoroughly insulated from our parents' criminal behavior that he genuinely believed this was all some kind of terrible overreaction to a family disagreement. "Marcus, they weren't just stealing from Eleanor," I explained patiently. "This wasn't about inheritance or family squabbles. They committed serious crimes that hurt a lot of people. The evidence is overwhelming." "But there are parents," he protested, as if family relationships could somehow override criminal law. "Surely there was a way to handle this privately. Did you really have to involve the police and destroy their lives?" The conversation lasted over an hour, with Marcus alternately pleading for me to somehow undo the criminal charges and accusing me of vindictive cruelty toward our parents. He couldn't seem to grasp that the decision to prosecute wasn't mine to make once the evidence had been presented to law enforcement. The crimes had been committed, the evidence was clear, and the legal system was now handling the matter according to established procedures. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the charges filed so far were just the beginning. The investigation into Eleanor's financial records had uncovered evidence of a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond what I had originally discovered. My parents hadn't just been stealing from Eleanor. They had been using her identity, her business relationships, and her financial resources to commit fraud against dozens of other people. Detective Santos had assembled a team of financial investigators to trace the full scope of their criminal activity, and what they were discovering was staggering in its breadth and sophistication. My parents had been running what amounted to a multi-year con game, using Eleanor's reputation and resources to facilitate crimes that had victimized business partners, contractors, and even other family members.
The evidence was so extensive that it required multiple boxes of documentation, and the list of criminal charges kept growing as investigators uncovered new aspects of their fraud scheme. What had started as elder abuse charges was evolving into a comprehensive financial crimes case that could result in decades of prison time. But my parents, even facing the reality of criminal prosecution, continued to believe they could manipulate their way out of consequences. They hired expensive defense attorneys and began crafting a legal strategy based on the same lies and manipulations they had always used to avoid accountability. Their defense team's approach became clear during the preliminary hearings. They were going to argue that Eleanor had been suffering from diminished mental capacity, that she had authorized all the financial transactions they were accused of stealing, and that I had manipulated the evidence to frame them for crimes they hadn't committed. It was a bold strategy, but it required them to systematically destroy Eleanor's reputation and present me as a manipulative schemer who had orchestrated an elaborate frame-up of her own parents. They were prepared to drag Eleanor's memory through the mud and destroy our family's reputation in order to avoid prison sentences. The preliminary hearing was held on a cold Tuesday morning in Judge Martinez's courtroom, the same courthouse where I would eventually sit watching my parents' final humiliation. But this time, I was there as a witness in a criminal case rather than as a party to a civil dispute. My parents entered the courtroom flanked by their expensive legal team, their faces carefully composed to project wounded dignity rather than criminal guilt. They had been released on bail after their arrest, and they had used the intervening weeks to craft their public image as victims of a vindictive daughter rather than as criminals facing justice. Their lead attorney, William Harrison, was a veteran criminal defense lawyer known for his ability to create reasonable doubt in complex financial crimes cases. His opening statement was a masterpiece of misdirection, focusing attention on family dynamics rather than criminal evidence. Your Honor, this case represents a tragic example of how family disputes can be weaponized through the criminal justice system, Harrison began, his voice carrying the perfect tone of sorrowful disappointment. My clients, Richard and Patricia Blackwell, are loving parents and devoted family members who have been falsely accused by their own daughter in what amounts to a vindictive prosecution based on a family inheritance dispute. He painted a picture of Eleanor as a confused elderly woman whose mental deterioration had made her susceptible to manipulation by a granddaughter seeking to gain control of her estate. He described my parents as devoted caregivers who had been systematically excluded from Eleanor's final months by my controlling behavior. The evidence will show that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell specifically authorized every financial transaction that the prosecution characterizes as theft. What we have here is not elder abuse, but rather a pattern of legitimate financial assistance that has been deliberately mischaracterized by a daughter seeking revenge against parents who dared to challenge her control over the family estate. It was a compelling narrative, skillfully constructed to deflect attention from the actual evidence of systematic theft and fraud. If you didn't know the facts, if you hadn't seen the documentation of their crimes, you might almost believe that this was indeed a family dispute being prosecuted as a criminal matter. But the prosecution had facts, and facts are remarkably resistant to narrative manipulation. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh began her presentation methodically, building a chronological case that demonstrated the scope and sophistication of my parents' criminal enterprise. She started with the simple theft from Eleanor's accounts and gradually revealed the more complex aspects of their fraud scheme. The credit card charges were just the beginning. Walsh presented evidence of forged investment documents, manipulated business contracts, fraudulent loan applications, and systematic identity theft that had victimized not just Eleanor, but multiple business associates and family friends. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a series of emails between my parents discussing how to manipulate Eleanor's business relationships for their own financial gain.
The emails, discovered during the search of their home computer, showed them explicitly planning to use Eleanor's reputation to secure loans and business deals they had no intention of honoring. In one email, my father had written to my mother, "Eleanor's name on the contract will get us the financing we need. She'll never need to know about it, and by the time anyone asks questions, we'll have the money moved to our accounts." My mother's response was equally damning. "Perfect. Her business partners trust her completely, so they won't ask too many questions about the details. We just need to make sure Eleanor stays focused on the medical stuff and doesn't get involved in the financial side." The emails revealed a level of premeditation and calculation that demolished any claim that their actions had been authorized by Eleanor or motivated by her care needs. They had been explicitly planning to deceive both Eleanor and her business associates for their own financial gain. But the most devastating evidence was yet to come. Walsh presented documentation showing that my parents had been systematically forging Eleanor's signature on business documents for over 2 years, using her identity to secure loans, sign contracts, and authorize financial transactions that Eleanor had never seen and would never have approved. The signature analysis was overwhelming. Experts had compared hundreds of authentic Eleanor signatures with the forged signatures on disputed documents, revealing clear patterns of forgery that could not be explained by natural variations in handwriting or changes due to age and illness. More importantly, the forged signatures appeared on documents dated during periods when Eleanor was either hospitalized or otherwise incapacitated, making it impossible for her to have signed them even if she had wanted to. One particularly damning example was a loan document bearing Eleanor's forged signature that was allegedly signed on the same day she was undergoing emergency surgery for a heart condition. Hospital records showed she was under general anesthesia at the exact time the document claimed she was signing a $50,000 loan authorization. As Walsh presented each piece of evidence, I watched my parents' faces for signs of recognition or remorse. What I saw instead was a kind of cold calculation, as if they were mentally reviewing their defense strategy and looking for ways to explain away each damaging revelation. They showed no genuine emotion about the evidence of their crimes, no apparent concern for the harm they had caused Eleanor or their other victims. Their only visible reaction was strategic, focused on how each piece of evidence might affect their legal defense rather than on the moral implications of their actions. The preliminary hearing lasted 3 days, and by the end, the judge had heard enough evidence to bind my parents over for trial on multiple felony charges, including elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The bail amount was increased substantially, and additional restrictions were placed on their financial activities pending trial. But even as they faced the reality of serious criminal charges, my parents continued their pattern of manipulation and denial. They gave interviews to local reporters, portraying themselves as victims of a vindictive daughter who had fabricated evidence to frame them for crimes they hadn't committed. The media attention was intense and largely sympathetic to their version of events. Without access to the detailed evidence presented in court, reporters focused on the human interest angle of a daughter prosecuting her own parents, presenting it as a tragic family story rather than a criminal matter. My parents used the media attention expertly, presenting themselves as heartbroken parents who couldn't understand how their own daughter had turned against them. They spoke about Eleanor with apparent affection, describing themselves as devoted caregivers who had sacrificed their own needs to ensure her comfort in her final years. The performance was masterful, hitting every emotional note that might generate public sympathy. They appeared on television looking older and more frail than they actually were, speaking in soft voices about family betrayal and the pain of being falsely accused by their own child. I found myself in the surreal position of watching my parents lie about me on television while presenting themselves as victims of my supposed vindictiveness. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming, seeing people who I knew to be criminals successfully portraying themselves as innocent victims of family dysfunction. But their media strategy, while effective in generating public sympathy, was having an unintended consequence. The attention they were drawing to the case was also attracting the attention of other potential victims of their fraud schemes. Detective Santos began receiving calls from people who had seen the news coverage and recognized my parents as individuals who had defrauded them in various business dealings. Eleanor's business partners came forward with stories of unauthorized transactions and suspicious contracts. Former neighbors reported instances of financial manipulation and theft that they had never reported to police. What emerged was a picture of systematic criminal behavior that extended far beyond the elder abuse charges originally filed. My parents had been running confidence schemes for years, using different identities and business relationships to defraud victims across multiple states. The scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from dozens of victims using sophisticated methods that demonstrated considerable experience in financial fraud. Eleanor hadn't been their only victim. She had been their most recent and most lucrative target. As additional victims came forward, the criminal charges against my parents multiplied.
The district attorney's office impaneled a grand jury to review the expanded evidence, and additional indictments were issued on charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The additional charges carried potential sentences of life imprisonment, and the federal government became involved due to the interstate nature of some of their fraud schemes. What had started as a local elder abuse case was evolving into a federal criminal prosecution that could destroy my parents completely. But they continued to maintain their innocence and their narrative of family victimization, even as the evidence against them became overwhelming. Their attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging the evidence, the prosecution, and even my right to cooperate with law enforcement against my own parents. The legal maneuvering continued for months, with my parents' defense team using every possible strategy to delay the trial and discredit the evidence against them. They claimed the search warrants were invalid, the financial analysis was flawed, and the victim testimonies were unreliable. Most importantly, they maintained their attack on Eleanor's mental capacity, arguing that she had been suffering from dementia during the period when the alleged crimes occurred and therefore could not have been a competent victim of fraud or theft. This strategy required them to present Eleanor as a confused and easily manipulated elderly woman, directly contradicting the careful documentation of her mental acuity that she had insisted upon during her final years. They were essentially arguing that the psychological evaluations proving her competence were either fraudulent or meaningless. The strategy was morally repugnant but legally sophisticated. If they could convince a jury that Eleanor had been incompetent during the relevant time period, they might be able to argue that her apparent authorization of various financial transactions was legally valid even if obtained through manipulation. But their strategy had a fatal flaw that they were about to discover in the most public and humiliating way possible. The trial was scheduled to begin on a Monday morning in October, nearly 8 months after my parents' initial arrest. The media attention had continued throughout the pretrial period, with my parents maintaining their public narrative of innocence and family persecution. They arrived at the courthouse that morning surrounded by reporters and supporters, their faces showing the kind of grim determination that suggested they believed they could still manipulate their way out of consequences. They had spent months crafting their defense, preparing their testimonies, and building their case for innocence. What they didn't know was that I had discovered additional evidence during the months of trial preparation, evidence that would destroy their defense completely and expose the full extent of their criminal enterprise. Hidden in Eleanor's business files, in a section that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, I had found documentation that proved beyond any doubt that Eleanor had been aware of my parents' theft and had been planning to expose them before she died. The documents included detailed records of her own investigation into their financial activities, copies of suspicious transactions she had identified, and most importantly, a comprehensive written statement describing their criminal behavior and her plans to pursue legal action against them. Eleanor had discovered their crimes months before her death and had been quietly gathering evidence to prosecute them. She had been working with private investigators and forensic accountants to document their theft, and she had been planning to file criminal charges against them when her illness made such action impossible. The statement, written in Eleanor's own handwriting and witnessed by her private investigator, was devastating in its detail and clarity. It described specific instances of theft, forgery, and fraud, and it explicitly stated that she had never authorized any of the transactions my parents claimed she had approved. More importantly, it demonstrated that Eleanor had been mentally sharp and fully competent right up until her final weeks, completely destroying my parents' defense strategy of claiming she had been suffering from dementia. But the most damaging aspect of Eleanor's statement was its description of how my parents had manipulated me to provide cover for their crimes. She had observed their strategy of encouraging my involvement in her daily care while systematically excluding me from financial matters, and she had understood that they were using my dedication to facilitate their theft. The statement concluded with Eleanor's explanation of why she was leaving her estate to me rather than to my father. Elena has shown genuine care and dedication without expecting anything in return, while Richard and Patricia have shown me that their interest in my welfare is entirely financial. Elena has earned this inheritance through her character and her sacrifice.
Richard and Patricia have forfeited any claim to it through their crimes. I had planned to present this evidence during the prosecution's case, but the defense's opening strategy gave me a better opportunity. Their attorneys spent 2 days arguing that Eleanor had been mentally incompetent and easily manipulated, painting her as a confused elderly woman who couldn't distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate financial transactions. It was exactly the opening I needed. On the third day of the trial, as the defense concluded their opening arguments about Eleanor's alleged mental incapacity, I approached the prosecution table and handed Ada Walsh a single document. It was Eleanor's handwritten statement, authenticated by handwriting experts and witnessed by independent parties, completely demolishing every aspect of the defense's strategy. Walsh requested a brief recess to review the document, and when court resumed, she addressed Judge Martinez with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from holding absolutely conclusive evidence. Your Honor, the prosecution has just received additional evidence that directly contradicts the defense's characterization of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell's mental capacity during the relevant time period. We request permission to present this evidence immediately, as it bears directly on the central claims made by the defense in their opening statement. Judge Martinez reviewed the document and immediately recognized its significance. Counselor, this evidence appears to be highly relevant to the defense's claims about the victim's mental state. The court will allow its immediate presentation. Walsh began to read Eleanor's statement aloud, and the effect in the courtroom was electric. Here was the alleged victim of the crimes speaking in her own words about the defendant's criminal behavior, directly contradicting every aspect of their defense strategy. As Walsh read Eleanor's detailed description of my parents' theft and manipulation, I watched their faces transform from confident determination to absolute horror. They realized that their entire defense strategy had just been destroyed by evidence they never knew existed. But the real devastation came when Walsh reached Eleanor's description of their manipulation of me to cover their crimes. The statement made it clear that Eleanor had observed and understood their strategy, and that she had deliberately documented it to protect me from any suggestion that I had been complicit in their criminal behavior. My parents' attorneys immediately objected to the admission of the statement, arguing that it was hearsay and that its authenticity couldn't be properly verified. But their objections were overruled, and the statement was entered into evidence as a dying declaration from the victim of their crimes. The impact on the jury was immediate and obvious. Several jurors were visibly shocked by the content of Eleanor's statement, and their expressions showed that they understood the implications for the defendant's credibility. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. After the statement was read into the record, he made an announcement that changed everything. Based on the evidence just presented, the court has reason to believe that additional crimes may have been committed during the preparation of the defense case. The court is ordering an immediate investigation into potential perjury and obstruction of justice charges related to false statements made by the defense regarding the victim's mental capacity. He turned to the bailiff. Please contact Detective Santos immediately. Based on what we've just heard, there may be grounds for additional criminal charges. The courtroom erupted. My parents' faces went white as they realized that their lies about Eleanor's mental condition had just exposed them to additional criminal charges. Their attorneys were frantically conferring, trying to figure out how to salvage a defense strategy that had just collapsed completely. But the real shock came when Detective Santos arrived and approached the defense table with additional arrest warrants. The investigation into their perjury had uncovered evidence of witness tampering and obstruction of justice that warranted immediate arrests. As the handcuffs were placed on my parents' wrists, once again, this time in full view of the television cameras and courtroom observers, their facade of wounded dignity finally cracked completely. My father's voice turned vicious as he was led away, screaming accusations at me and at the prosecutors who had exposed his crimes. "This is what we get for raising an ungrateful child," he shouted as the bailiffs restrained him. "She's destroyed her own family because she's too selfish to share what she stole from Eleanor." My mother's collapse was more theatrical, wailing about family destruction and asking how her own daughter could be so cruel to her parents. But the performance fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence of their criminal behavior. The trial continued without them, as they were held without bail on the additional charges. Their defense team attempted to continue representing them, but the case had become hopeless. The evidence was overwhelming. The victim's own statement had destroyed their defense strategy, and their behavior in court had demonstrated their character more clearly than any prosecutor's argument could have. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges.
The sentences were severe. My father received 25 years in federal prison, my mother received 20 years, and both were ordered to pay full restitution to all victims of their crimes. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of their punishment. The media coverage of their convictions was extensive and devastating, exposing them publicly as criminals who had stolen from a dying woman while manipulating their own daughter to cover their crimes. Their reputations, their social connections, and their financial security were completely destroyed. The life they had built on the foundation of lies and manipulation collapsed utterly, leaving them with nothing but the consequences of their choices. As I left the courthouse after the sentencing, I felt no satisfaction or triumph. The victory was hollow because it had come at such a tremendous cost to everyone involved. My family was destroyed, my parents were going to prison, and Eleanor's memory had been dragged through a public criminal trial. But there was also a profound sense of justice and closure. Eleanor's courage in documenting their crimes had ensured that they faced consequences for their actions. Her final gift to me hadn't just been financial. It had been the truth, carefully preserved and strategically revealed to protect both her memory and my future. The inheritance that my parents had tried to steal, both through civil litigation and criminal activity, was finally secure. But more importantly, the truth about our family dynamics was now part of the public record, preserved forever as evidence that competence and character matter more than blood relationships or social performance. I had spent my entire life being dismissed and undervalued by people who saw me as an inconvenient obstacle to their desires. In the end, those same people had been destroyed by their own underestimation of both Eleanor's intelligence and my determination to seek justice. The internal ledger that had tracked every slight and dismissal for decades was finally balanced, not through revenge or manipulation, but through the simple application of truth and consequences to people who had spent their lives avoiding both. As I drove away from the courthouse that day, I realized that I was finally free from the family dynamics that had shaped my whole life. I was no longer the dismissed daughter seeking approval from people who were incapable of giving it. I was no longer the invisible caregiver whose sacrifices went unrecognized and unrewarded. I was Eleanor's granddaughter, inheritor not just of her wealth, but of her values and her commitment to justice. I was a successful attorney who had used her skills to ensure that criminals faced consequences for their actions. I was a woman who had chosen truth over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. The people who had tried to steal my inheritance were spending the rest of their lives in prison, and the legacy they had tried to claim was being used to build something better than they had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.